Today, we're going to be covering a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart. In honor of May being Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to cover something a little bit different. Instead of just the usual digital forensics topics where we're talking about bits and bytes and how to deal with data. Today, I wanted to talk about the mental health effects of something that a lot of us in the industry have faced over the years, and that is we come across a lot of traumatic information, a lot of videos, a lot of media files that I think we all know what I'm talking about through the course of our investigations. Some of us from the law enforcement side would get some support from our organizations. Some of us on the private side would see the stuff, but there was nothing really in place to help us deal with that. And I think it's a problem, and it's not really talked about a lot in our community. So, in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to bring in a professional who deals with these types of traumatic events and kind of help guide us through some of the steps of the causes and the effects and how we can deal with it. So, uh, with me today is Chris Smetana. Chris is the founder and CEO of Mind the Frontline. Their website is, make sure I get this right, mindthefrontline.org, and we'll have that on the screen for you. Chris has over 2 decades of experience in clinical education, leadership, and frontline emergency response. And he's been researching and investigating healthcare for first responders and their families. And so Chris today is going to help talk through some of these points with us and maybe how it relates to some of these traumatic events that we see as digital investigators. So, Chris, thank you.
Dan, thank you so much for having me on the show. And, you're right. I've been doing this for 23 years and going on 24 as a first responder. I've spent time in the Department of Defense as a contractor, as a firefighter, as a flight paramedic, search and rescue tech, tactical medic. And I went through my own mental health challenges in 2021 that culminated with an attempted suicide of my life. And out of that, after being committed for 10 days, I really started trying to reach out for help. And what I found is the resources for first responders were pretty much non-existent. You reach out for help, you get a stigma, you fall on what I call these landmines. I looked for therapists. It took me almost 6 therapists to finally find one that worked for me. My first one wanted me to go through EMDR, and it didn't work out. It left me feeling extremely triggered. I tried to find a ketamine clinic and found out it was kind of just like a drug farm. They didn't really know what they were doing. It was just like a new business, so to speak. And so they elicited, a lot of them do this, they elicit, that, hey, we're for first responders, we're for PTSD. And really, they really don't know. They have great intent, don't get me wrong. But first responders, public safety, forensic techs, like we're all a part of a different breed, I would say. And the trauma that we see is cumulative, similar to almost going to combat nonstop for 23 years. Like I never rotated off. I didn't have a rotation off. I've been doing this consistently. And not to discount veterans or active duty military personnel, but at the end of the day, it just gives you a perspective of how hard it is to do this job, and it's not for everybody. So out of that suicide attempt, after being committed, after finding all these challenges and realizing like, holy cow, like the system really is broken out there. That's why I founded Mind the Frontline. And I did it because I couldn't find good resources. So that's kind of one of our pillars is we have a state-by-state resource guide that breaks it down and has national resources. And then we start doing outreach and education to inform our own community of first responders, frontline workers, healthcare, physicians, correction officers, lifeguards, ski patrollers, really anybody that is involved on the front line of public service, and I would include forensic technicians. We see things and those things can have a lasting impact. And not only can they have a lasting impact, they can really affect our lives in a negative or a positive way. And so I really just saw the initiative and wanted to make a change and do something about it. And so, hence Mind the Frontline was born. So I really appreciate you having me on to talk about trauma, talk about PTSD, talk about some of these things that we don't talk about very often, because I think it also just normalizes the conversation, because there's a lot of people out there that I know feel the stigma. They don't want to put it out there. They're not as transparent as I am, and that's okay. But I do feel like having these conversations normalizes that, and it also allows us to have these conversations and encourages those individuals to either seek help or talk about it. Not everybody needs, is in crisis, but I think there's a lot of people that hold on to this stuff and they don't know what to do with it. And that in itself can be a detriment.
It's funny you say that because I know just from my work over the years, I would, we would of course come in contact with a lot of generally just very traumatic media that we would see things doing digital forensics that maybe aren't expected. All kinds of stuff is absorbed in people's phones and computers, even if it's unintentional. And like I said, I noticed kind of what you said as well. From some side, on the law enforcement side, there were, depending on what agency you were working for, who you were working through, there were varying levels of understanding of what it took. Some agencies were very good about monitoring the personnel and seeing what they needed. Most honestly had no kind of monitoring at all. Then I know when guys get on the private side, guys and girls, sorry, when forensic investigators get on the private side, um, there's not an expectation that they'll come across that stuff as much, and so maybe there's not even anything at all guarding them. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I know that you prepared some statistics and things for us to talk about today, which I want to hear about. But I also wanted to jump real quickly ahead to something. When we spoke previously, you used the term moral injury to describe kind of those incidents that sort of start this thing. And just before we get into the statistics, could you just describe that term? Because when you said it, when I heard moral injury, I hadn't heard that before, and I thought that was a perfect description of exactly what we're talking about. I think you put a really fine point on it.
Yeah, I think it helps people at least ask the question, have I had a moral injury, or how often am I having a moral injury? And that's important because the moral injury is kind of that's the incident. When we look at it, the medical definition for it is going to be the psychological phenomenon that occurs when an individual experiences a violation of their moral or ethical code, resulting in profound feelings of guilt, shame, psychological distress. And really, that kind of goes and encompasses the work that we see. For me as a first responder, when I see a patient who might have had a traumatic event or a cardiac event, a medical event, that to me is very traumatic. My brain doesn't know how to process that initially, right? It kind of scrambles everything. That's the same thing with like forensic technicians. When you stumble across a file or you see some of these images, it can be extremely, extremely disturbing. And your brain doesn't know what to do with that. It's conflicted. It's like, hey, this is not right. Like we see some of the bad, bad stuff of society, some of the worst stuff in society. And you really get to take a hard look at humanity as a whole. And that causes you to question, that causes you to have this conflict within your brain. And that, when you see it for the first time, that creates that moral injury, which then, depending on the type of the event and how strong it elicits those feelings and emotional responses, your brain wants to protect itself. So it kind of shuts down almost. And then what it ends up doing is that kind of leads you into what we call PTSS, which is syndrome, right? So syndrome is kind of like a temporary, it's kind of like I got a bruise, right? But if I don't take care of this bruise, it's going to continue to bleed and bleed and bleed. And if we don't take care of that PTSS or that bruise within the first 30 days of that moral injury, we know through the studies and research that it will more likely turn into what we call PTSD. And that's something that is now stuck with you. Like that's a permanent scar. It ain't going away. And there's a whole myriad of emotional, mental responses that come with just having that moral injury turn into PTSS, which then turns into PTSD. So moral injury is kind of what you would say the insult, right? That's the death by 1,000 cuts almost. Like we're getting these cuts all the time. What we don't often have, like you elicited to, is we don't have any armor when we're going out there as forensic technicians, as first responders. Even some programs are better than others. Some are just lip service, as I've been able to find out. Like, yeah, they got a peer support guy. I don't know what his phone number is. I don't know
how to don't know how to find him.
Sometimes I've even heard the agencies that have that. People will call and use the peer support line. Nobody answers. You're like, oh. Well, it took a lot for me to ask for help, and then nobody's going to answer. It's like It's like being like, hey, I'm drowning over here, and the lifeguard's looking right at you, just waving back at you like goodbye. So, when I talk about moral injury, like that's an important part, right? Like when you look at something or you take something in, your brain needs to process that. And if that's in conflict with your morals, your character, who you are, big, bad, ugly, or something, it shocks your brain, your system, your autonomic system, and it goes, I don't know what to do anymore. Like, I don't even know how to process. I don't even know what file to put this in because I've never seen it. It's so grotesque, or it's so violating your mental, emotional space that causes that cut. Now, if we don't take care of it, it gets infected, and then it turns into PTSD. Is kind of a basic analogy on how I could put it.
Statistics. You and I talked about some of the statistics that you were going to share with us today, and to call that eye opening, I think isn't even accurate. So if you could talk your way through some of those, because
Yeah.
I found those to be alarming, to be completely honest with some of those, and if you could go ahead with that, because I think a lot of people need to hear this.
So I'm going to preface this research and this data that I'm going to share with your audience with, we don't have a lot of first responder mental health data and research out there. That's one of the things that Mind the Frontline is trying to do, is do good research so we can understand better, so that way we can better respond. If we understand what's going on and how to treat it, or kind of some of the signs, symptoms, things like that. But these are general numbers I'm going to pull from the public safety side. When it comes to forensic technicians and things like that, there's nothing that exists. But what I can say is anecdotally, if you look at public safety and what happens over here and go, hey, we're kind of doing the very similar kind of type of work over here, you can anecdotally say, I'm sure there's some crossover. Now, what that percentage is, I can't tell you because I don't have any data behind that. But what I can tell you is that when the National Alliance on Mental Health, NAMI, when they did a study back in 2019, and then they updated this in 2021 after the pandemic, initially at 2019, it was 37% of firefighters and first responders experienced post-traumatic stress. You saw the suicide rates in excess of 5 to 7% of the general population. Now, you might say 5 to 7% is not that big, but when you look at like just one industry, which is not made up of like hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's law enforcement, public safety, first responders, EMS, forensic technicians. It doesn't make up a huge number of, like, say, compared to the technology industry, right? The numbers over there are so much larger. But for our small group, 5 to 7% is a significant number. And when you look at like 2019, 37% had PTSD. Well, now that number is excess of 40 to 45. And why that is so important, people are like, well, 45, that means almost half of our industry is running around with a ticking time bomb. And I know this because I was that ticking time bomb. I lived it. I know exactly what PTSD is. I'm very familiar. I have CPTSD clinically diagnosed, and major depressive disorder, and anxiety. These are all things that come with this bag of PTSD. Now, when you look at these numbers and you go, okay, well, out of those 50%, now 7% of those are killing themselves almost every year. April alone, I think we had eight or 10 that I was tracking of first responders that took their life throughout the United States in just 1 month. And those are the numbers that were reported, because once again, we're not reporting and we don't have good data. So I'm sure, I'm 100% positive that number is drastically more than what we're seeing, because sometimes it doesn't get categorized right. When you look at some of the coroner's report, right? Like, they're very standard. It's throughout the nation. It's a standard reporting system. And so they don't really have something for first responder / suicide. It's just like suicide, male, female, very generalized. That's one of the things why we're trying to change some things. But when you look at those numbers and why that's so statistically important, 50%, if you say approximately almost 50% of our workforce of first responders, forensic technicians, are probably walking around with some form of PTSD. Some of them are going to be varying in intensity and frequency, and what those signs and symptoms and how they manifest themselves. And that's the important part, because when you also look at, conversely, like the number of substance abuse rates for just our industry, they're staggering. When you look at burnout rates, they're in excess of 45% as well. So, okay, so I have PTSD, I'm burned out, I have almost 10 times the chance of having a substance abuse disorder compared to the general public. Like these are numbers compared, like 37% to 50%, 2019 to 2020 of PTSD. The general public, to give you comparison, 3.5%. So we're about almost 15 times, almost 15 times higher than the general public. And why that's so important is because, and I'll get to the whole like why we're here. I think, in my personal opinion, but why that's so important is when you look at the substance abuse rates, right? So alcoholism, gambling, sex addiction, diversion, drugs, all that stuff that we see happen amongst fellow first responders, like it happens. I used to be like, oh man, those guys are just giving the rest of us a bad name. Now I look at it in a more empathetic light, going, I wonder what's underlying, like what's the root cause here? Because there is a root cause. Then you look at the divorce rates, right? They're almost 4 to 5 times greater than the general public, like, and they're climbing too. So, and that's just the numbers that we know of. So why is this so important? Because it negatively affects our industry. It shows itself up in different ways, substance abuse, divorce, affairs. And we've heard of all of this stuff. Like if you're in public safety long enough, you probably know someone, you probably did it yourself, but there's a root cause for that. And that goes back to that PTSD. A lot of us are walking around and not even aware that we do have PTSD, that we have some of these challenges that we now need to, like I said, it's not going away, but if you're aware of it, now you can actually mitigate it and you can treat it and you can recover from it, like I am.
So in the world of digital forensics, just because of the way our industry has evolved, I'd go out and say, I bet still a solid 70% of the people in our industry probably still do hail from law enforcement. And I was thinking about kind of all the first responder incidents and things like that you were talking about, and thinking about my career in particular and how it relates to what you're saying. And I think a lot of people listening would relate the same way, in that I had all those normal go out, be a policeman, daily sort of things on top of once I got into the digital forensics and started seeing kind of the other side of it too. And then you started talking about, suicide, alcoholism. And from my experience, I lost a lot of friends to suicide, law enforcement friends, law enforcement and fire. Um, and you said the illicit affairs, the addictions, all those things are so common. So I hope everybody who's watching right now is paying attention, because it's just not just the other side of the first responder aisle. It's us too. It's the people in the digital forensics field. So you named some of those things. That maybe are very obvious. You can see a guy, a lot of times you can see that guy in the squad room, or that maybe is developing a drinking problem or something. But what are some of the indicators? Are there indicators that maybe like a self check, where a person who's doing work and maybe it's gone on? Because I know I worked with some guys who could go their entire careers and they never had sort of any kind of obvious negative effects. It seems like some stuff could just roll off them. Some people, they would do like forensics. They would come across this stuff the first couple times and they said, this is not for me and I'm going to get out. Do we know why some people manage that better? Do we know why some people, is it just, are some people just better equipped, or do they have a better support system? Do we know?
There is studies that are coming out to answer that question. Now, there's nothing definitive, but what we are seeing trends in is you're more likely to have PTSD in first responder, public safety, or forensic technician if you had any sort of childhood trauma or unresolved trauma that you brought into the career, right? A lot of us in public safety, we are drawn to a life of public service, and some of that might have stemmed from our childhood experiences. The other side of that, I think you mentioned, and you made a very good point, and this is the point that I like to make with everybody. When we get into these professions, forensic technician, for example, like what kind of initial training is there for mental health and resiliency to give you those tools to go, hey, it's not just about diet and sleeping. Like it's diet, it's sleeping, it's emotional, it's spiritual. There's 4 main components that you need to look at. But are you given those tools, right? And I compare this, comparison, because this analogy I think will resonate with a lot of people. When I go through the police academy, I get a weapon, I get body armor, I get a vest, I get a ballistic helmet. I'm they're giving me the armor to go and do the job, right? To physically do the job. But what armor am I getting and putting around my head to emotionally and morally and mentally, stay resilient? Because it's part of the job. Like, it's inherent. Like, if you're in public safety, you're going to see some of these moral injuries. You're going to have them, right? So if we're not, and when you ask that question, like, hey, what makes it some better than others? Seems like some people go through their career 20 years and it doesn't even phase them. What I would say is, more than likely, they had some really good emotional intelligence, awareness. They had tools when they got into this job through their upbringing, through school, whatever that might look like. But they got those tools. They got that armor. And then there's the other half of us, like me. I didn't get any of that armor when I got into the fire service, when I got into DoD. Like, there was no training on mental health and awareness and things to look out for. And hey, this is what you should probably be doing every day, and this is what you should probably be doing after you have a moral injury. And then we develop these really bad coping techniques like alcoholism, substance abuse, addictions, and things like that, because we're looking for a way to cope. Our brain is trying to find some way to make this okay. And so we go naturally, usually alcohol. Alcohol is extremely prevalent in our industries. It doesn't matter whether you go to a conference or you're off duty, it's just everywhere. And it really is a really bad coping mechanism. So when you ask me, like, hey, why do some people seem like they can be okay and some not? It's just because they have what we call like an emotional tolerance window, and their window is a lot bigger because they have these tools. They're able to talk about their emotions. They're able to meditate. Maybe they get outdoors. They can connect with their emotions, check in with themselves. Maybe they're spiritual in some regard, religious or not. It doesn't really matter. But those are the tools that bring in the resiliency part of that. And if we send these people out with no armor, essentially, around their brain, their skulls, uh, you're just walking out there naked almost. And so you're more susceptible to get a moral injury because you got nothing to protect yourself. You got nothing to bounce that up. You have nothing to filter that. And then when it happens, you don't even know how to respond to it. You don't even know how to do it. And sometimes there's a lot of people, especially like myself, you don't even know that you are so far gone. You have people around you tell you, and you still don't listen. Nah, they're full of it. I'm not that bad. I'm okay. And then your life starts going to chaos, and then you start losing friends, or you start having those suicidal ideations, and that sucks. It sucks to be in that place. You're alone. You're isolated. So why does some of these things bounce off others and more resilient on others? You're seeing the trends of, you have to have this information beforehand so you can recognize it. So emotional awareness, emotional intelligence. Then you got to have the tools to actually work through it when you do have it, right? So when something happens, you got to be able to recognize it in yourself and go, okay, maybe I need to read, maybe I need to, check in with a friend, maybe I need to go to, I always tell everybody you should have a therapist, like, just go once a month, whether you just want to talk about the sky or the sports or whatever, but you should have someone as part of that, especially if you're in this career field.
Well, so on that point, and I think that's an important one too. So where do these where do the clues come from? I mean, does it depend on the person? I've been married a while, and the first person that would tell me that something's going wrong is going to be my wife. She knows me better than anybody. I would probably tell her she's wrong and keep doing what I'm doing. And I guess that's how we get into those problems that you're talking about. But like, where should people be looking for indicators? I mean, are people,
Yeah.
is it something that if can I be educated? Can someone give me a list of things that say, hey, you need to be on the lookout for these in yourself? Or is it more commonly from those around us, coworkers, friends, spouses, sisters, whatever? I mean, where should we be looking for those kind of cues that maybe we're not taking care of ourselves, or that we've maybe taken on more than we can deal with?
Yeah, maybe some of the indications that moral injury has turned itself into PTSS, or has
Right.
turned itself maybe into PTSD. Um, I will say that, if you have that emotional intelligence awareness and you're listening to the show, like, as I explain some of these indicators, ask yourself, like, do I have any of these? If I do, I'm telling you, you have a very high statistically chance of that you probably have either PTSS or PTSD, and that's okay. Like, that's the first thing. We got to smash the stigma. So whatever I'm saying here, doesn't make you any different, doesn't make you any less of a person, doesn't make you broken. So please don't take it that way. But it's important to go, hey, do I have these signs or symptoms? More importantly, look for these signs and symptoms in your coworkers, right? The buddy check. This is why we call it the buddy check. If you can look at, and see some of these signs and symptoms in your fellow colleagues, say something. And if you're not sure how to do it, there's resources out there, especially on our website. That's what we do. We try to give resources so people can have these difficult conversations because they're uncomfortable and some people just don't want to do it. But if we don't speak up, well, look at what the suicide rates are doing. So I don't need to say anything any further other than that. But when you look at, when I have a mortal injury, how do I know it's kind of progressed into that PTSS phase, right? So we have the 0 to 30-day window from the point of impact, the point that I got that first cut, whatever I saw, whatever I did, whatever that environment I was exposed to actually stuck with me. That's that mortal injury. That's the initial sentinel event. You now have 30 days to turn that around before it sticks with you forever. And then what happens is it gets cumulative. So every one that I have that I don't treat becomes more. And before you know it, it becomes very, very heavy, and you no longer want to even take that walk. But the first sign I would say is intrusive thoughts or flashbacks. Like if you see something stirs you up, and you go home, and if those nightmares or those dreams or those flashbacks are not leaving you within 14 days, that's a sign that you have PTSS. That's a sign that you need to go in and speak with the therapist. This is also why I preach, get a therapist now, because on average, it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get into an office to see someone clinically. So you see where that 30-day window comes in? If you don't have a therapist, like, you might be hosed.
You might be already behind.
You're already behind the 8 ball. And so you really, you got to press yourself, and that you need to advocate for yourself. Like, hey, I think I have PTSS. Can I please get in as soon as possible? And they have things like EMDR treatment. They're going to help you process, reorganize, refile, and put that away so you can walk forward. But that would be one of the things. When you look at disruptive sleep, night sweats, night terror, hypervigilance, meaning like you're always wired, always on edge, always anxious, right? Like that anxiety is another sign that if it's within that 30 days, you probably have PTSS, especially if it's not going away. And then I think a lot of us can relate to these next couple ones. But when you look at like interfering with daily life and functions, what do I mean by that? Like I'm talking about social isolation. Like I just don't want to hang out with anybody. I just want to go home, play on my phone, play on my Xbox. I don't want to talk to the world. Isolation is definitely one of those signs. And that's a sign that we could use as a buddy check. Hey, so-and-so used to always come and hang out, and we used to do dinners or, whatever that looked like, activities, sports. And now all of a sudden they're not doing any of that. That's a sign. For me, a lot of this stuff is like when you look at irritability, anger, emotional outbursts. That was me. I would come home. I would be great at work. Like, dude, I at work, I was like a gym. But when I came home to my family, man, I was a dick. And it's because I was irritable. I would have outbursts over the little thing, like, hey, my daughter leaves something on the floor. I would blow it up, right? Like those are things. And I, once again, didn't think anything of it. My wife, she definitely did. She didn't like living with someone like that. My kids, I mean, everybody in my house was walking on eggshells. So once again, I couldn't see that in myself, but it took some hard recovery to get that out. But if you find yourself like you're just snapping, you're flying off the handle at little things, like, I mean, there's the the rational emotional response to a situation, and there's the irrational. So ask yourself, was that a rational response or was that irrational? And that might help you in that moment decide, like, is this getting to me? And you also see all of these signs that I'm talking about in PTSD. So everything I say that for PTSS, it just amplifies itself once it gets to PTSD because now it's untreated. It's going and going, and we're probably stacking some more onto that. We also look at like emotional numbness. And I got that a lot. Like initially I was very attached. I was an empathetic individual. I loved what I did with my career. And then all of a sudden I just kind of found myself like, I'm just transporting people from A to B. I really didn't care anymore. I didn't care about people. Emotions. I would have people pass away. I remember my sister called me and told me she was getting a divorce. I was like, that sucks. I couldn't feel. And I just thought, like, I just discounted it. Like, oh, I got battle hardened, right? Like, no, that's
I
not
think,
normal, folks. Like, that's
I
not
think,
normal.
I think that sounds like the most common thing, maybe, because I think we all think after a while, like, hey, I'm used to it. I've seen this, I've done this, I'm used to it. I never thought of that as actually being a sign of something, because you're right. It's not normal to not react to
It's
something
not
like that,
normal.
is it?
Yeah.
Hmm.
My grandma
I,
passed away. She was really close to me. Didn't feel anything. Like, and that
wow.
should have been a red flag for me to go, like, this is not right. But I grew up in a culture where everybody was like, yeah, that's normal. Like, you just get used to everybody dying, and so you're fine. No, it's like that. Once again, that should not be the norm. We've just culturally made it and said, oh, I don't know how to deal with this, so we're going to call it normal. No, it's not normal, folks. Like, we really shouldn't. We should be feeling, having emotions, crying, things like that. Like, that's real, and that's what we should be doing. Also look at, like, stomach pains, chronic headache, sleep disturbances and patterns. You can't go to sleep, or you're getting broken sleep. Like, all of these things basically are saying, like, there is some sort of underlying psychological distress. What level of that is? Well, that depends on, where you're at in those first 0 to 30 days. And that's why I say, hey, if you're still having any of these signs and symptoms after 14 days, you really probably should get into a therapist, a licensed clinical professional, hopefully that is culturally competent. And what I mean by that means they actually do know first responders and mental health, and what we do, as forensic technicians, as police officers, as firefighters, EMTs, any of that, because there's other ones out there that just don't understand it, and it could lead you to the inability to connect. That's why I say try to find a therapist now, because you might go through six, and if you were waiting 4 weeks for each one of those, you can see how much time that might take. It could take up to 6 months to a year for you to finally find a therapist that you can connect with. But most insurance plans will give you 12 a year. You might as well use it. You know, it's if anything, it's just good for your emotional state, and what I call basically emotional maintenance, because this is something that you have to do every day, especially if you're in this career field. Because if you don't, you're pretty much sliding backwards. It's going to happen, you know. So those are just some of the things that you could look at, and if we don't get ahead of it within, that 30-day window, like I said, that's when it turns into that PTSD. That's a lifelong scar. That's something you're gonna have to live with, carry around for the rest of your life, and learn how to deal with it. And it can be very, very uncomfortable. And it usually is in the first uh, bit of your recovery, is what I say. Uh, but I'll tell you, you can't just ignore it. It ain't gonna go away, folks. It doesn't go away. It only gets louder. It causes more chaos in your life. It causes more distress. It'll cause you to basically just be emotionally unbalanced, like where you just will never find that peace. And that's not fun to walk through life like that.
I wonder. So when you're talking about the buddy check system, or even having your family, people close to you, recognize things like that. A lot of us in the forensics field actually tend to work kind of alone anyway. And a lot of agencies on the law enforcement side, and even on the private side, there's not some of them, the smaller units don't have much of a team environment. And certainly a lot of them aren't going to have the kind of support mechanisms in place that are going to catch stuff like this. I think for me, a takeaway from what you were saying was, it seems like it would be a great idea for anybody listening who says, you know what, if I was kind of going in that direction and I'm looking around, I'm not sure who would catch it if not me. That I'd like to see
Mm-hmm.
people maybe sit down and have a conversation ahead of time with friends, family, coworkers, maybe that aren't even in their own individual unit, that just say, hey, these are the kind of things that maybe if you ever notice this about me, maybe it's time to do a check in with me. Because I think if people aren't trained to look on that, um, if you don't understand the stressors, that maybe I would not recognize that in someone that I was working with. Like I said, the mystery to me was always that some people could seem to get through this stuff with seemingly no negative effects, and other people it hurt them. And if I'm one of those people that just doesn't really feel it, and it doesn't have sensitivity to something that other people, maybe normal people should have, I might not recognize it in someone else. So I'd like to see people, anyone who's listening to this, to sit down with some people that are around you, whether they do the same job or not, and just say, hey, these are some of the things that you could look out for me, that maybe I wouldn't recognize in myself. I mean, is that something? I think your first your first suggestion that people should just probably go ahead and get in and start talking to someone professionally. Anyways, that's probably the gold standard. But I know
It is.
from our industry, from law enforcement particularly, and first responders, you said it right in the beginning, and you nailed it. There tends to be still, even in this day, of we're far more enlightened than we were when I started in law enforcement back in the 90s. But there's still a lot of places, there's still a stigma about that. People are worried like, oh, if they find out I'm going to see somebody, that I'm not going to get the promotion, or I'm not going to be considered for the high stress positions. you know and it's maybe a big leap to trust that even though your agency, your department, or whoever has said, yeah, we've got these services available, it still kind of feels like a trap, right? We don't trust the man. So
We get
I
that a lot. I get that a
you,
lot.
right.
And that's why we founded Mind the Frontline. Like, we're a third party service. So I think there's a couple of good points there. Um, set up a calendar reminder for, maybe every 3 months, once a quarter, like sit down with yourself, go over the signs and go, hey, do I have any of these? That'll help you self-recognize, right? You could even do it monthly, right? That way you're always staying up on it. And that's part of what I preach as far as mental health and wellness. It's a daily thing. This is something you honestly should be doing daily. You can also share some of these signs. And if you go to our website, we have stuff for significant others, for spouses, buddy checks. Like, we have resources, blogs, things like that talk about exactly what we're talking about. So they can look at it and go, hey, I can write these down and hand them off to my spouse or my significant other, my husband, my wife, somebody one of my good friends, that I see regularly. Hand that off to them and go, hey, do you see any of these signs in me? And if they say yes, like that should pique your awareness to go, okay, like, once again, you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. Okay, this is a moral injury. You can get over it. You just aren't aware of it sometimes. So you can provide those resources to them and say, hey, if you see these things, by all means, let me know. And hopefully now that you are somewhat aware, because you're getting a little bit of the education, you're becoming more familiar with it, you'll be able to receive that feedback and go, okay, time to go talk to someone, time to go do something about this. Maybe I need to get on some SSRIs. Maybe I need to get on some anti-anxiety meds. And all of these are just temporary things. I would absolutely say just go talk to someone, make it a regular habit. That way, when it does happen to you, you're not behind the 8 ball. And then, talk to someone. So you mentioned like a lot of forensic technicians, and there's a lot of industries, physicians sometimes, and smaller rural access, critical access hospitals, things like that. They are very isolated. They don't have another physician to talk to or bounce things off. Sometimes they might be the only clinical professional in that area. And so that's why we created our peer support program, right? Like, this is a number that you can call and talk to a fellow first responder about anything. It doesn't have to be about like, hey, I'm in crisis or I'm thinking about hurting myself. It could be like, hey, maybe you need somebody else like us to help guide you through. It doesn't cost you any money. It's free. It's 100% free. Like, it's 24/7. If you want to talk to them, you can text. Like, that's why we did it. We tried to reduce the barriers of it, having people want to initiate that contact, because that's the only thing I can't do for you. I can show you all these signs. I could talk about all this research. I could talk about all the statistics, but I cannot have you actually physically do something about it. That choice comes ultimately up to you. So, that's why, the number is 866-MIND, MIND 24/7. So you can call and text that number and talk to a fellow first responder, that has that experience. They have training. A lot of our volunteers are recovering themselves, and that's okay. Like, we kind of created this own little community over here. We have a weekly online peer support group every Monday. People are more than welcome to jump on that and just listen, be anonymous, be a fly on the wall, and just kind of, once you get comfortable, you can speak up. But it takes recognizing the signs and then actually acting on them. But that's the whole first part. We got to educate people on what the signs are so they can go, hey, does this apply to me? And if it does, okay, now how do I do something about it? And once again, a lot of people just don't know, hey, the signs, B, what to do about it, C, where to even begin. And so I would encourage them to go over to our website, check out the blogs, check out the podcast. You'll find a wealth of knowledge over there.
So Chris, when we first started talking about this, and I think you'd acknowledge this as well, that when it comes to first responders and the moral injuries, the digital forensics, I still kind of new in that world. And so you said that there really wasn't any statistics that you were aware of that focused on that group as well. But I hope that through our conversation that that's kind of maybe brings it to the forefront, maybe a little bit for you, since it's a kind of a new area. If we had people watching from our industry that maybe wanted to donate or volunteer their time or help support your organization, how would they get in touch with you to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always looking for state ambassadors, and our state ambassadors are law enforcement, corrections. I mean, they're in any walk of life. So we would love to have some forensic technicians that give us those perspectives and make sure that we're creating some sound initiatives for the unseen. You know, we have dispatchers that are a part of our group because all, you know, dispatchers get left out all the time, you know, you know, we basically run off of donations and support. So we have two ways to support. You know, you could either go to, you know, www.mindthefrontline.org and donate. You could also go to that same website and then go and click on our membership page. Become a member. It's I think it's $25 or $50 a year. Yeah, it's $50 for the year, and you get all these resources. You get all these blogs. You get access to we have virtual peer support. We have online weekly stuff. We have monthly webinars. You know, there's just so much there, and that hopefully will give you those tools and educate you on what we just talked about today. And if you need to talk to someone, that's free. It's completely free. And if you need resources, you know, next week, I believe we're going live with our individual state resources. And if you have a resource that you're using as a forensic technician that you want to share with other forensic technicians, I invite you to submit that resource on our website so we can get it on there for that state or for that national level. But you're right, there is no good statistics out there, but I do think you could say there is some crossover with that data with forensic technicians, because I can only imagine, you know, what you guys see on the daily, you know, and that's got to be hard. And if you don't unpack that and you don't process it and you don't talk about it and you just internalize it, it's going to eat you alive. And you mentioned there's some of them that seem like apparently it just rolls off of them. I'd also say and challenge you to sometimes those are the people that are really hurting in silence. And those are the ones that actually that scare me the most when it comes to suicide rates, because it may seem like everything is okay. And that's the front that they put out there. And really what they are, they're silently struggling on the inside. They just don't want to talk about it, or they don't know how to deal with it. And so, you know, it's a real conundrum at the end of the day. It's a problem and it ain't going away. And so how do we fix it? Well, we try to do something about it.
Chris, thank you so much. I think this is the most valuable conversation that I could have helped to bring to my industry that I could have imagined. I really appreciate your insight. I appreciate the great work that y'all are doing, and we'll make sure that we have all the contact information on here so that if anybody hopefully is inspired by what you've said and wants to get in touch, I would love to find out that you know, we were help guiding people to your organization. So Chris Smetana, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having me on. You guys all have a great day and be safe out there.